The furnace had been shut down according to every procedure. Fuel was cut. Airflow was reduced. Men stood outside and waited for the temperature to fall. But the bricks inside began to glow brighter. Metal fixtures groaned as they expanded. The instruments said the fire was dying. The structure said otherwise. They had stopped feeding it, and still it grew hotter. The furnace had been in operation for 11 hours when the shift foreman gave the order to begin shutdown. It was a large reverberatory unit, built for smelting copper ore, and it had been running cleanly all day. The charge had been drawn. The slag had been tapped. What remained inside was residual heat and the slow movement of air through channels designed to carry combustion gases toward the stack. The men who worked around it knew its sounds. They knew the color of the brick when the fire was at temperature. They knew how long it took for the glow to fade after fuel was cut. Shutdown was not a complicated process. It had been done dozens of times. The fuel supply was closed first. Then the draft was throttled back by adjusting dampers in the flue. The expectation was that the fire would starve, the temperature would fall, and by morning the interior would be cool enough to inspect. There was no reason to think this time would be different. The furnace had been operated within normal limits. There had been no unusual loading, no alarms, no deviation from procedure. The men began the process with the same confidence they brought to every shutdown. They closed the fuel line. They adjusted the dampers. They checked the instruments mounted near the charging door. The pyrometers, crude as they were, showed the expected drop in temperature near the mouth of the furnace. The foreman made a note in the log. The fire was declared out. The crew moved on to other tasks. 2 men remained nearby to monitor the structure as it cooled. This was standard practice. Even after shutdown, a furnace this size retained enormous heat. Brick and metal contracted as they cooled, and sometimes the movement was loud enough to be mistaken for structural failure. It was considered good sense to keep someone nearby in case adjustments were needed. The 2 men stood outside the furnace room and waited. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded as expected. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the instruments, but from the building itself. One of the men noticed that the air near the furnace wall felt warmer than it should. Not cooler, warmer. He mentioned it to the other man, who dismissed it as residual heat radiating outward from the brick. But 10 minutes later, both men agreed that the heat was intensifying. They opened the observation port and looked inside. The refractory lining, which should have been fading from yellow to dull red, was still glowing bright orange. In some sections, it appeared brighter than it had been during operation. The men closed the port and checked the instruments again. The pyrometers near the charging door still indicated a falling temperature. The draft gauge showed that airflow had been reduced as planned. Every reading suggested that the furnace was cooling, but the heat they could feel and the light they could see told a different story. One of the men went to find the foreman. When the foreman returned, he opened the observation port himself and stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he closed it and walked around the perimeter of the furnace, placing his hand near the outer shell at several points. The shell was warmer than it should have been. He ordered the dampers opened slightly, thinking that increased airflow might help draw heat out of the structure. The dampers were adjusted. The men waited. The heat continued to rise. By now, the discrepancy between what the instruments reported and what the structure exhibited had become undeniable. The pyrometers said the fire was dying. The furnace said otherwise. The foreman sent word to the plant superintendent. He did not yet say that the situation was dangerous, only that it was unusual. The superintendent arrived within the hour. By then, the glow inside the furnace had intensified to the point where it could be seen through gaps in the brickwork. The outer shell was hot enough that a man could not hold his hand against it for more than a few seconds. And still, the instruments insisted that cooling was underway. The sound came next, a low, uneven creaking that seemed to originate from deep inside the structure. It was the sound of metal expanding under heat, but it was louder than the men had ever heard during normal operation. One of the iron tie rods that braced the furnace wall began to glow faintly where it passed through the outer shell. The men could see it changing color in real time, darkening toward red. The superintendent ordered everyone back from the immediate area. He did not evacuate the building, but he made it clear that no one was to approach the furnace until they understood what was happening. A debate began among the men. Some insisted that fuel was still burning inside, that a valve had failed to close completely, or that residual gas was feeding a hidden flame. Others argued that the fuel line had been physically inspected and found to be shut. There was no gas, no oil, no coal dust. The fire had been starved, and yet the furnace behaved as if combustion were accelerating. A third group suggested that the airflow itself was the problem, that reducing the draft had somehow trapped heat inside rather than allowing it to escape. The superintendent listened to all of them and made no immediate decision. He ordered the dampers closed further, then opened again, then returned to their original position. None of it made a difference. The temperature inside continued to rise. By this point, the refractory brick in the hottest sections of the furnace was glowing white. The outer shell had begun to radiate enough heat that men standing 15 feet away could feel it on their faces. The creaking of the metal framework became constant. One of the observation ports cracked, and a thin jet of superheated air hissed out into the room. The men sealed it with clay and backed away. There was no fire visible inside the furnace. No flame. No combustion. Only heat, intensifying in defiance of every expectation. The first attempt to intervene came from a senior furnace operator who had worked with similar units for 20 years. He believed that the problem was a lack of airflow, that the heat was accumulating because it had no path to escape. He proposed opening the stack damper fully and forcing air through the furnace to carry the heat away. The superintendent agreed. The damper was opened. For a few minutes, the men thought it was working. The stack began to draw more strongly, and the sound of air moving through the flue became audible. But within 10 minutes, the temperature inside the furnace spiked. The glow intensified. The outer shell grew hotter. The increased airflow had not cooled the structure. It had made things worse. The damper was closed again, and the men stood in silence, trying to understand what they had just seen. Another man suggested flooding the furnace with water, but the idea was rejected immediately. Pouring water onto refractory brick at this temperature would almost certainly cause it to fracture. Steam expansion could blow the structure apart. The risk was too great. A third proposal was to open the charging door and allow heat to radiate out into the room. The door was unlatched and swung open. The wave of heat that poured out was so intense that the nearest man staggered backward and had to be caught by another worker. The air shimmered. Paint on the opposite wall began to blister. The door was closed again, and the men moved farther back. The furnace was now more dangerous than it had been at any point during operation. It was no longer being fed. It was no longer being controlled, and it was growing hotter. The superintendent ordered the building evacuated except for a skeleton crew. Word was sent to other plants in the region, asking if anyone had encountered a similar situation. No one had. The men who remained watched the furnace from a distance and waited for something to change. Hours passed. The heat did not subside. The glow did not fade. The structure continued to expand, and the sound of metal under stress filled the room like a low, continuous groan. The explanation, when it finally came, did not come from the men at the site. It came from an engineer who had studied furnace design and had encountered reports of similar phenomena in older European smelters. He arrived the following day and spent hours examining the structure, the materials, and the operational logs. What he described was a chain of conditions that no one had anticipated. The furnace had been designed with thick refractory brick, the kind that could withstand prolonged exposure to extreme heat. That brick had been absorbing thermal energy for 11 hours while the furnace was in operation. It had stored an enormous amount of heat, far more than the fire itself contained at any given moment. When the fuel was cut and the airflow reduced, the fire died quickly, but the brick did not. It continued to radiate heat inward toward the center of the furnace because there was no longer enough airflow to carry that heat away. The reduction in draft, intended to starve the fire, had also collapsed the convective currents that would have pulled heat out of the structure. The furnace had become a closed system. The heat stored in the brick had nowhere to go. It radiated inward. It intensified. The air inside the furnace, now moving slowly, could not carry the heat away. Instead, it absorbed it and grew hotter. The refractory lining, instead of cooling, began to re-radiate its stored energy back into the space it surrounded. The result was a feedback loop. The more the airflow was reduced, The more heat was trapped. The more heat was trapped, the hotter the interior became. Opening the dampers had only made it worse, because the sudden influx of oxygen-rich air had allowed the superheated gases inside to undergo a secondary reaction, releasing even more energy. The furnace was not burning. It was glowing. It was radiating. It was releasing energy that had been stored in its structure over hours of operation, and that release was happening faster than the structure could dissipate it. The engineer explained that certain furnace designs, particularly older reverberatory types with thick refractory walls and restricted airflow paths, were prone to this behavior. Shutdown, under the wrong conditions, could trap heat rather than release it. The solution was not to stop feeding the fire. The solution was to allow controlled airflow to continue long after the fire was out, so that the stored heat could be drawn away gradually rather than accumulating inside the structure. The furnace eventually cooled, but it took more than 2 days. The men maintained a minimal draft through the flue and kept the dampers partially open, allowing heat to escape slowly without introducing enough air to cause further reaction. The outer shell remained too hot to touch for more than 30 hours after shutdown had begun. When the structure finally cooled enough to inspect, the refractory lining showed signs of severe thermal stress. Some sections had begun to crack. The metal framework had warped slightly. The furnace could be repaired, but it could not be operated the same way again. Word of the incident spread quietly through the industry. Other plants began to re-examine their shutdown procedures. Engineers revisited the assumptions that had guided furnace design for decades. It had always been understood that fire was dangerous. What had not been fully understood was that stopping the fire could be just as dangerous, or more so, if the structure itself had become the source of heat. The men who had stood outside that furnace and watched it grow hotter after shutdown carried the memory of it for the rest of their careers. They had done everything correctly. They had followed every procedure, and the furnace had responded by becoming something they no longer recognized. It had taught them that a furnace is not simply a container for fire. It is a reservoir for energy, and that energy does not vanish the moment fuel is cut. It lingers, it accumulates, it radiates inward when it has no path outward. Shutdown is not the end of danger. Sometimes it is the beginning. The furnace that would not cool became a reference point, a cautionary tale, a problem that had no visible cause and no immediate solution. It was a reminder that heat, once stored, does not ask permission to be released. It simply waits.